In this demo, we will go over how to create a Windows 10 reference image using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2013 Update 2. The guide that we'll be using to record this demo is referenced here on TechNet. The link that you can use to get access to this same guide is actually provided in the PowerPoint materials that were delivered with the Windows 10 deployment workshop for education. And this guide, there are some steps here that are outlined that reference some names of devices. Like, for example, here we have a domain controller, MDT01, a Hyper-V server, and a client machine called PC0001. Now, my machines in this demo don't reference these specific names of machines, so when you go through this guide on your own, you might see in my lab environment that I've got different names for different machines. Just be aware that this environment that they're referencing in this guide is based on this link here that says Deploy Windows 10 with Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. Now, for the reference image, you might be wondering, okay, well, why do I need to create a reference image? Reference images are used to help you automate the creation of your image. You might be used to creating your image with some of the tools that we've been using for a long time, going back to Windows Vista or Windows 7, like ImageX or DISM, and creating your image with SysPrep, and having to do all this stuff manually using the tools that either came from the Windows AIK or the newer Windows ADK. Well, MDT leverages all of those tools, but the nice thing about MDT is that we can automate the process and also have it be self-documenting, which really allows us to have what we consider a task sequence that has all the different steps that are in the image. Right now, with your images, you might be creating an image and then manually installing apps and manually creating different settings, and you have a big build document that could be either dozens or hundreds of pages in some cases. And it's a really long and elaborate process to go through and create that image. Well, with MDT, we can actually have it self-document that whole process, and in this way, you don't have to go through and remember every single step, because you could just look at your MDT task sequence and see exactly how the image was built. And this is good for being able to have someone else do the imaging. Maybe you're not going to be doing it later and someone else is going to come along and take care of that. Instead of them having to look through some build doc or try to figure out what someone else did, the MDT task sequence will just show them exactly how the image is created. So before we create that reference image, though, we need to install MDT and set up the deployment share. So I've got a server here that already has MDT installed. If you need to install MDT, this link here, which is also included in the slide deck materials, this link will show you how to prepare your deployment for MDT 2013. There are some prerequisites and some things that you'll need to do. Once you have it installed, though, you can come back to this video and we can go through the rest of the process of how to create your deployment share and things like that. So let's move over to our deployment workbench, which gets installed with MDT 2013. So if we go to the Start menu and we scroll through it, if you're using Windows Server 2012 as or 2012 R2 as your MDT server, then this is the experience you'll be going through. With 2008 or 2008 R2 or even Windows 7, you can install MDT on a client OS. Any of those, you'll be able to access the Start menu and get access to the deployment workbench here. So we click on Deployment Workbench, and we'll notice here that we have this node here called Deployment Shares. And in my environment, I've got two deployment shares set up. I've got this one, and I've got another one that I created for another demo. So I'm going to create a third deployment share. In your environment, you probably won't have any deployment shares at this point, so you'll need to create a brand new deployment share. But you can have multiple deployment shares on a single MDT server. So you might want to have one deployment share for one group of users, and then maybe you have a separate deployment share for a separate group of users. That wouldn't be uncommon in education just because of how decentralized a lot of the IT is. You might have a centralized MDT server, but you might have a group that manages their own images, and you have a separate group that manages a separate set of images. So in that case, you might actually have multiple deployment shares. So what we need to do is right click on the deployment shares node and select new deployment share. And I'm going to create my deployment share on my E drive, and I'm going to call this deployment share 3. And the deployment share is just a collection of files that are going to be necessary for us to image a machine. So this would include your operating system image files. It'll include applications if necessary, any patches that you might want to include, any patches that are in the form of a Microsoft update file or a .msu extension. So we'll create the share, and then we also need to give the share a name. So by default, it's going to try to call it deployment share $, but I already have a share with that name, so I need to put 3 in here. So I've called this deployment share 3, and the $sign just means that the share is hidden. So if someone were to try to enumerate the shares on this server, they won't actually see deployment share 3 because there's a $sign that's been appended to the end of the name. And then for the descriptive name, I'm just going to call this deployment share 3. And then for my options here, when you go and image a machine with MDT, it uses what we call light touch installation, or LTI. LTI just essentially means that there is some sort of input that a user is going to have to do through a wizard that they'll have to go through before they could kick off the imaging process. You might have also heard of a term called ZTI, or zero touch installation. And a zero touch installation is something that we leverage with System Center Configuration Manager. And that'll actually allow you to have zero touch whatsoever. Someone could just boot off of a USB stick or off of Pixie, and the operating system can have zero input from an end user. With MDT, we don't have zero touch, we have light touch. So LTI is a term that you might hear a lot when dealing with MDT. So in this case, we have some options here that we have to specify in order to get the image process started. I'm going to leave these at default, but for your environment, you may want to adjust these as necessary. And then I'll hit next. And the process is done. Our deployment share has been created. And you'll see that I've got the third deployment share here. So now that we have our deployment share created, we need to import our operating system into our deployment share. But before we do that, let's take a look at what the next steps are here in the build doc. So we've created the deployment share, and the next step is to configure permissions for the deployment share. Now, I don't necessarily need to do this because I'm using a domain admin account, so I have permissions to the captures folder, but in your environment, whoever is responsible for doing the imaging may not necessarily have the right permissions with their own user account. So you might have to create a build account. So in this case, we've created an account here in the guide called MDT_BA. So this is just the MDT build account. But by default, that account, which is a domain account, doesn't really have admin rights to, or doesn't have the appropriate rights to this captures folder. So what this step is telling you to do is go ahead and grant those rights to that account. If whoever is supposed to be doing the imaging already has rights to that account, then, or rights to that folder, then you don't have to worry about this step. But if you have people within your organization that will be creating images and copying them up to that captures folder, then they're going to need the appropriate rights. So if you need to do this step, go ahead and configure this within your environment. In our case, we don't necessarily need to do that. So the next step here is to add the setup files. So the setup files are the Windows 10 installation media. Now this guide is going to tell you to go through and add the Windows 10 Enterprise x64 source files. We're actually going to be using Windows 10 Education, but the steps are pretty much the same. There's no real difference, it's just the difference in media. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So we have our operating systems node, and we need to right click and select import operating system. You're going to have 3 different options here of how you want to import your operating system. The first option is to use a full set of files from source media, and this is your media that you can get from volume licensing. The second step here is your custom image, and this is if you have a custom image that maybe someone else created and it's based on a WIM file. So you might have central IT, and they might create a centralized image that everyone has to use, but they do allow you guys to customize it a little bit. You just have to make sure that all the settings are the same. If that's what you have, then you can leverage this custom image file. The third option here is to use Windows Deployment Services images, and we won't really be focusing on this. This is not a very common scenario. What most people end up doing is actually using the full set of source files from volume licensing when it comes time to create their reference image. So go ahead and click Next here, and then specify the source location of where your files are located. So in my case, I have created a folder called Downloads and Windows 10 1511 Education. Now notice in this file name that it says 1511, and that's the version number of the media. So when Windows 10 was first released, it was called Windows 10 1507, and that was when it was released, July of 2015. In November, we came out with another release, and that was in November of 2015. So the nomenclature for the naming of Windows 10 goes by year and month. So in this case, we're using the 1511 education media, and I'm actually using 64-bit media here, although the folder doesn't say it. This is a 64-bit source ISO. I just extracted the files from that ISO and I copied them here. And I also have the option here to move the files from this location into my deployment share, but because I use these files for other things, I'm going to keep them here, and I'm just going to have these copied directly to the share. So now we'll want to hit Next and go to the next step here in the wizard. And we need to give the destination directory a name of where we want this to be copied to within our deployment share. So we have Windows 10 Education and Retail Technical Preview. I don't really like how this is named, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to call this Windows 10 Education 1511 x64. And then we'll just take Next throughout the rest of the wizard. This is going to take a little bit of time to copy. And our copy is now complete, so we'll click Finish. And in our operating systems node, we have Windows 10 Education copied in. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, this says Windows 10 Education Retail Technical Preview. Is that a problem? And no, it's not. You're going to see this with your media. And in the media you get from volume licensing, this is what you'll see. Disregard that it says technical preview. That's not an issue. You do actually have the valid production media that we've released in volume licensing. So now that our image has been, or our source files have been copied in, let's take a look at what the next step is. So our next step is to add applications. Now, in this guide, it has you go through a number of different applications to install. We have Office 2013 Pro Plus, we have Silverlight, and then we have a number of Visual C++ redistributable files that need to be added. So we're going to do things a little bit differently in this demo. Instead of using Office 2013 Pro Plus, we will actually be installing Office 2016 Pro Plus. Actually, what we're really going to be installing is Office 365 Click to Run. Now, you might have a different version of Office that you want to include in your image. If you use the steps that are in this guide, this goes through using the Office customization tool. And this guide is very good in getting you set up with that. But my demo steps aren't going to be these exact steps here. So if you have to use either Office 2013 or Office 2016, then go ahead and use that and leverage the Office customization tool. But if you want to do Office 365 Pro Plus using Click to Run, that's what the demo is going to go through. So let's take a look at what that looks like. To add Office 365 Pro Plus, we need to create a brand new application within our deployment share. Now, before we do that, let's take a look at where I've copied the files to for Office 365 Pro Plus. So on my server here, I have under my E drive the applications folder, and under applications I have a number of other folders here. Under here I've got Office 2016 deployment tool. These are the files that come with the Office 2016 deployment tool. And I've got a setup executable here and a configuration.xml. And this is all I'm going to use to install Office 365 Pro Plus. And you might be thinking, well, where are all the other files? Because if you go back and you look at Office 2013, for instance, this is probably what you might be more familiar with, where you have a setup executable and then you have all of the other Office files that are associated with a standard legacy Office install. When we deal with Office 365 Pro Plus, leveraging Click to Run, we actually download the binaries directly from the internet. And that's what I'm going to do here. Now, you don't have to do this. There are different command line switches that you can use for Office 2016. I'm not going to get too deep into all the different ways that you can use to install Office within your image. But just know that there are other ways to do this. You don't have to download the files directly from the internet every single time. You could copy these files locally and have a local copy that is used for your reference image. But I want to just really show how easy it is to do the Office 365 Pro Plus install within your image. So we've got our files here. This configuration XML is what the setup exe is going to leverage to install Office 365 Pro Plus. So let's take a look at what's inside of this XML. Now this XML file has it's very simple, it's very easy to configure and see what it's really doing. What we're going to be doing is installing Office Client Edition 32-bit. So we're doing a 32-bit install of Office instead of 64-bit. Even though we're using a 64-bit piece of Windows media, we're actually going to be using 32-bit Office. And this is really just because of compatibility issues that could arise if you use macros or anything that requires a specific architecture of Office. If you know you aren't going to be doing those, then you could change this from 32 to 64 and you'll run the 64-bit version of Office. And we also have different branches in Office. I'm going to be using the business branch, and that's what you should be using. But there are other branches that you can use. There's a current branch and there's a business branch. So pick the branch that makes the most sense for your scenario. Business is the one that's going to be most common in most environments. We're also setting this up to use the English language, and I'm also including Visio Pro in here as well, and leveraging the English language as well. And then I've also included that updates be enabled within Office 365. What this means is that Office 365 updates on its own. There aren't separate downloaded files that you have to go out and procure and deploy. Now, if you're using a product like SCCM, or if you want to control these updates, then you have that capability. But if you just want Office to update and just make sure that your users have the latest version of Office installed, and you don't have to worry about micromanaging all of the updates, you can specify that updates enabled be set to true, and then specify the branch of updates that you want to be leveraged. And in this case, we're going to specify the business branch. Lastly, we have display level set to none, which means that there's no UI that gets shown to the end user. In our case, when we're imaging, we don't want to see any UI. We just want this to be done behind the scenes. Because if there are any dialog boxes that pop up, it's going to stop our task sequence and wait for someone to actually click on something within that UI. And then lastly, we're going to accept the EULA, and that's basically it. So let's close out of the configuration file, and I'm just going to hit don't save. And let's create this application within our deployment share. So what I want to do is right-click and select New Application. And when we create a new application, we have a number of different ways to do that. I'm going to select the first option here that says Application with Source Files. And next I want to give this a name, so we'll call it Office 365 Pro Plus. And the publisher, version, and language are optional, so we won't fill those in. And then we need to specify our source directory. And then we have the option here to select whether we want to move the files or copy them. I'm going to just let it copy on its own. I'm not going to move these files. And the destination name is fine, Office 365 Pro Plus. And then I need to specify a command line. Now you want to make sure that when you're specifying command lines for applications that you have a silent command line. Because if you just put setup exe in here, then a dialog box is going to pop up, and there's going to have to be some sort of user intervention to get through that dialog box. So in our case, because we're using Office 365 Pro Plus, we have the ability here to pass a configuration file, and that configuration file, in it, I've specified that I don't want any UI showing up. So that's not going to stop our task sequence. We want to make sure that the task sequence just keeps going. You might have other applications that that you want to install, and those also have to be installed silently. You want to make sure to get the silent switches, and that could be a challenge in some cases, depending on the application. It could be an old app that you might have to spend some time searching on the internet for what the silent command line is for that app. So we'll go ahead and click Next, and we'll click Finish. And now we have Office 365 Pro Plus installed. So let's take a look at what the next step is. So the next step here says to connect to the deployment share using Windows PowerShell. And this step here will allow you to import a PSD1 file for the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. So a PSD1 file, this is a PowerShell, this is just a PowerShell script that'll run. Now, these PowerShell commands in this guide, some of them are actually incorrect. For instance, there is no commandlet in PowerShell called import topic. So this is wrong. What you would want to do is actually do import module. So because some of these steps have some issues, I recommend instead of using the PowerShell, which normally can make this job really easy, I'd actually recommend doing these by hand. And yes, it is going to be tedious and it will take some time, but the end result is that you'll have all of your applications, all of these Visual C++ files imported. Now, this is completely optional too. You don't have to install all of the Visual C++ files, but what you'll find is that there are applications that you will be installing in your images or during deployment or maybe even after the fact that do require the Visual C++ runtime files. And oftentimes the Visual C++ files will be delivered by the applications that you're installing, so you don't have to worry about it. But having them already in the image can make things a little bit easier because you don't have to worry about whether the Visual C++ files are there because they're already baked into your image. So completely up to you on how you want to deal with the Visual C++ files. I do it in my images, but again, it just really depends on if you want to take the time to do it. So let's go through this process and see just exactly how we would go and import these Visual C++ files. Now, before we go and create the application with an MDT for the Visual C++ runtimes, we need to actually get those files first. So what you can do is just do a search on the internet, right-click, copy, and here the second link here will take us to the download for the Microsoft Visual C++ 2005 SP1 redistributable package. So we want to download that and do this for each of those Visual C++ redistributables. So that there's a lot of them, so it's going to take you a little bit of time to get through that. I've already pre-done that, so in my environment, we'll take a look at what I've already downloaded. So here on our MDT server, let's take a look at our folder, or our Windows File Explorer, and we'll go to E and Downloads, and I've copied all of the Visual C++ runtimes. And again, I downloaded all of these manually. Now, when you go through this process, you want to make sure that you have a good folder structure, because if you download these all to the same folder, you're going to have a problem. And that problem is that the file name is the same for these. So for instance, the 2005 SP1 x86 is VC Redist x86, and then if you go and look at 2008 SP1 x86, again, it's the same file name. So if you're trying to download all of these all at once, and then they all go to your downloads folder, for instance, you're gonna just be prompted to override the file. So you want to make sure to download these to their own specific folder. Now let's go and create an application for one of these. So we'll right-click on applications, and we want to use an application with source files. And for our application name, we'll call this VC, or which one is this one? Microsoft Visual C++ 2005 SP1 x86. And then for our source directory, so we'll pick the x86 one for 2005 SP1. And for our command line, we want to use obviously we need the file name. And for these, it's pretty easy to get these to install silently. We just put a /q. But this isn't the case for every single executable. So again, you're going to want to validate for other executables that you're trying to include within your image or other applications. And then we'll just hit next and finish throughout the wizard. And then now we have our Visual C++ 2005 SP1 x86 in here. We need to do this for all of the other Visual C++ files. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be doing all of those for this demo, but you will need to do that for your environment. So I went ahead and copied in the other Visual C++ files from a separate deployment share that I already had created those in, just this way so that we can see what this looks like from a task sequence perspective later on. So let's take a look what the next step is in our deployment guide. So we need to create a reference image task sequence. So task sequences, if you're not familiar, they are just sequences of steps that MDT will go through in order to deploy an operating system. So let's go ahead and right-click on task sequences and say new task sequence. And we need to give a task sequence an ID name, so we'll just give it a 1. The ID doesn't really matter, you can call it whatever you want. And then for our task sequence name, we're going to call this Windows 10 Education 1511 x64 reference image. And for our task sequence, we have a number of different ones that we can use. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to use standard client task sequence. Now we need to select our operating system image, so I'm going to select this one here. And I don't need to specify a product key, so I'm going to leave this blank. And for the organization, I'll just call it blue. And for our admin password, I will specify a password here. You can put whatever password in here you like. And next. So now our task sequence has been created, and it is using the operating system image that we specified earlier for Windows 10 Education 1511. Now let's take a look at the properties of this task sequence, just see what it's doing. So in our task sequence, we'll see that we have a number of different expandable nodes. These folders, we actually call them groups. If you go to add here, you'll see that there's a new group. The folders are groups. And then each group has a specific task sequence step. Now, don't get caught up in the size of this task sequence. As you can see me expand all of the different nodes, it looks like there's a lot of things going on, and there are quite a few things going on within this task sequence. You don't really have to worry so much about what every single step in here does. There's a lot of documentation on the internet that can help you understand what all of these steps do. The MDT help documentation can also help with that as well. What I would like to focus on, though, is that the steps that you see in here are to really help you get through the process of imaging. It's not to really confuse you, even though that it can be confusing, can be daunting to look at it. Don't worry about every single step that you see here. But also understand that this task sequence is dynamic, and it can do different things depending on the options that are specified within the MDT deployment wizard. So when we look at these groups, for instance, I'm just going to pick one of these at random. I'm going to pick state capture here. So this state capture group has a number of steps that are baked inside of it that are falling below, and they're actually nested groups. So how does the task sequence work? Does it just go step by step? Well, it can, but you can also have variables and conditions on whether something goes into a different group. So in this case, we have a task sequence variable phase equals state capture. So we're going to go into this group if the variable name of phase is set equal to state capture. So if that variable does not equal state capture, then we don't go into this step. So this depends on whether or not you specify in the wizard, I want to capture user state. If you specify that, then this variable gets set. If this variable is set, then we go through all of these steps. So a lot of that happens within the task sequence. So if you're curious about how we get into new computer only, well, the deployment type equals new computer. So we're going to go through these steps. We will validate, and the validation steps are, do we have enough memory? Do we have enough CPU? Are we a client OS? If we are, then we'll keep going through. If not, then we'll fail the task sequence because we're not the correct, we don't have the correct specifications that we need in order to get through this. And then we go through and we do some formatting and some script copying. So you'll see that there's a lot of things going through here, and it's a really dynamic task sequence. But again, don't worry about understanding what every single step in this task sequence does, at least not initially. Over time, you'll be more comfortable. You'll start to get through it, and it'll make a lot more sense in the future. But what we want to focus on here is the process in here under this state restore phase, because state restore has some steps in here that are actually valid for what we want to do next, because we've imported our apps, but we need to make sure that the applications are put in the right spot within the task sequence. So let's take a look at our guide and see what the guide really says for creating this task sequence. So we've done all of this, and now we need to edit the task sequence. So it says under state restore, enable the Windows Update pre-application installation. So what this will do is this will turn on Windows Update. So that's this step right here. We need to turn that on. So you'll notice that it's grayed out. So if we go to options and uncheck disable this step, it now goes from a gray icon to a green icon. But you might be thinking, okay, well, I've got a green check mark with in a white circle, but what about the next option here that has a full green circle with a white check mark? Well, that just means that continue on error is off. So if continue on error is unchecked, then this means that if there's a failure here, it'll fail right here at this spot. It won't continue on within the task sequence. So that's what the full green check mark means. The white check, or the white circle with the green check mark, is just that this is the continue on error box is checked. So we'll have Windows Update run, and what this will do is it'll go out to the internet, and when it goes out to the internet, it will download updates directly from there. You can also leverage an internal WSUS server if you want to go through that process. So we've enabled Windows Update, and we'll let this go out to the internet, and then we have install applications. So what do we have for our applications to install? So this also says that we need to enable the post application installation action. We'll do that. But then it has us creating a new group action called custom tasks. So let's go ahead and enable the Windows Update post application section, and then let's also create the custom tasks right after the tattoo action under state restore. So we're under state restore, we have tattoo, and now we need to create a new group, and we need to call this custom tasks. Okay, so we have our custom tasks group here, and now we need to put some things underneath this group. And it's always a good idea to put a prefix in front of your steps that you're modifying that are different from the default steps, just so you know what you've added versus what came with the task sequence. So I like to put custom in front of everything I do. So as we go through this, you'll see me put in as a prefix the word custom, just so I know what is different about my task sequence steps. Now the next step here is to create and rename custom tasks to custom task post Windows Update. So we have after Windows Update post installation action, we need to rename custom tasks to custom tasks post Windows Update. So in the task sequence, we'll see here that we have custom tasks up here, and then we have the other one right after this Windows Update. So let's enable this. And then for custom tasks, we'll rename this step to custom tasks post Windows Update. Now I'm going to customize this custom task group and just call this pre-Windows Update, just so it's clear. And then I'm going to add a new option here for installing roles and features. So if we go back to the guide has, for our next step, is to install Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5.1. So let's go back and see here that when we install roles and features, we can select what operating system we want to do this for. So in our case, we want to use Windows 10. I think the guide actually references Windows 8.1. So this is somewhat of an older guide, even though it says for deploying Windows 10 reference images, it just needs to be modified. But for Windows 10, we can do the same process. And this is something that you really will want to do, is you want to install .NET Framework 3.5. If you aren't doing .NET Framework in your image, installing it after the fact can sometimes be challenging. It's just best to have it baked into your image to avoid any unnecessary installations of the .NET Framework. So we'll select .NET Framework 3.5. And so now we have this selected, we need to add our applications that we want to install before Windows Update. So we'll rename this install.NET Framework 3.5. And then we need to install our other apps. So let's go ahead and hit add and select install application under the general section. And we'll do Office 365 Pro Plus. We'll select install a single application and we'll browse to our Office 365 Pro Plus. Click on apply, and it mentioned there's an error. That's because this is still red here. If I select that, that'll go away. Oh, and for the group, that's fine. Yeah, custom tasks. Okay, perfect. So the next step here is to add another application. So I'm going to add my Visual C++ runtime. So I need to go through all of these and get those added. So I just finished adding all of the Visual C++ runtime files into the custom tasks group. So we have the .NET Framework 3.5, we have all of our Visual C++ runtimes, then I also put Office 365 Pro Plus down here, and then I've also added a restart computer step. Let's rename that, have custom in front of it. So now our steps should tell us now that we've basically finished adding all of the applications, and now we need to add our suspend, or we have an option here to suspend the MDT task sequence. So what's nice about doing a suspend is that you might have an application that you need to install and you can only install it manually. Maybe you can't install it silently, or maybe there's just some reason that it's just easier for you to modify the OS manually. If that's the case, then you can use a script that is a part of MDT called LTI suspend. And that script, what it'll do is it'll stop the task sequence, and on the desktop icon there will be or on the desktop there will be an icon and an app or a shortcut to run to resume the task sequence. So you can do whatever you need, creating the image, and then double click the resume task sequence and move on through the task sequence. Again, that's optional. I'm not going to do that in the demo. I don't need that in my task sequence, but there might be a reason for you to do that. And then we also have some options here to edit the unattended XML file for your image. And if you're not familiar with the unattended XML file, the unattended XML file will allow you to modify behaviors within your image for a variety of different settings. There are tons of settings that you can modify within the unattended XML file. To get to that file, if we go back to our MDT environment, we'll see that we have this OS info tab at the top. And we have an unattended XML or edit unattended XML file button here. If we click on that, it's going to generate a catalog for this specific operating system image, and it will take quite a bit of time in order for it to do that. So MDT's finished generating the catalog file. Actually, the catalog file was created by this program called Windows System Image Manager, or WSIM or WISM. This depends on who you talk to and how they pronounce it. But this is the unattended XML file that MDT is already using. So this is kind of a strange program to use if you're not really all that familiar with it. And quite frankly, you probably won't really be modifying this too much, but it's worth mentioning just so you kind of understand when people talk about unattended XML, you might wonder what the heck that is. Well, it's just a XML file that has a number of settings for the different phases that Windows goes through when it's trying to set up a image. So in the guide, it lists how we go through and modify the unattended XML file. In Windows Sim expand the for specialized node in the answer file pane. So that's this number 4 that we see here in this screenshot. And it's mentioning to modify some of the Internet Explorer settings here. So this is just for demo purposes, so you can modify just about whatever you want. So in here, though, we have some settings here for Internet Explorer. You can modify whatever you need here. I'm not really going to modify any of this because I don't do this in my images, but you might have a need for it in yours. There's also shell setup, which you'll notice here that there's some stuff that's already filled in, like registered organization. Remember earlier I typed in blue for my organization name? Well, we see that here. We also see the registered owner, the time zone, do not clean taskbar. So there's some things that MDT has already populated in this unattended XML file. So if you ever have a need to modify any settings within Windows, the unattended XML file is a good place to look for something that might be useful within your environment. Going back to our guide, the next step here is to configure the MDT deployment share rules. Now, understanding rules is critical to successfully using MDT. The rules are configured using the Rules tab of the deployment shares properties. So if we go back and if we close out of our Windows System Image Manager, I don't need to save anything from that, and we hit OK on the task sequence and go back to the deployment workbench. Under the deployment share, if we right-click on the share and select Properties, there's a tab up here that says Rules. Now, rules are really important in MDT because this will allow you to automate quite a few things within MDT. Now, this demo isn't going to go over every single thing you can because it would make this demo really, really long. So what we will focus on, though, is just kind of some of the common ones that you can add. And the guide actually goes through a pretty good job of explaining what these files do and what they are. So you'll see here that there's a snippet here of rules, and it basically saying modify using the following information. So there's a lot here that you can add. I don't know that I would necessarily go and skip all of this stuff. Although, if you do skip all of this, it will make your image process faster. One thing I do want to highlight, there are actually two things I want to highlight in here. First is this WSUS server. This is where you can specify the WSUS server that you want your image to get WSUS updates from. Instead of having to go out to Windows Update every time you create an image, this WSUS server can make downloading updates much more simple and save you quite a bit of bandwidth every time you need to go out and download new updates. So this is definitely something you want to have. And also SL share. SL share is what we use to copy log files. So if your image fails and you want to see why it failed, if the SL share property or variable is specified within your MDT custom settings INI or the rules tab, if it's in the rules tab, then it'll copy the log files from the share or from the machine to the share. Now you also see that we have things like skipping admin password, skipping computer name. When you're creating a reference image, it's actually a good idea to skip all of this because you want this process to go as fast as possible, having as little user intervention as possible. Because all we really care about is getting that image onto the device and captured. So I'm actually going to copy and paste this right into my share. So I'm just going to override the defaults that are here. And then I have a WSUS server here, so I'm going to use that URL. And it's important when you're dealing with your WSUS server to know what port you're using. You could be using 80 or 8530, depending on your WSUS install. If you want to know what port is being used by your WSUS server, you can see the port right here. So I'm using port 8530. And then for the SL share, okay, so I'm ready now to move on. And then for the Bootstrap INI, we can modify this to prevent us from having to authenticate to the MDT server. It will just automatically use whatever account is in the Bootstrap INI. So if we go back to our Rules tab on our deployment share, we can click on the Edit Bootstrap INI. And then by default, it just knows that I can go to deploy root on my MDT deployment share, and I don't have any username and password specified here, so it's going to prompt for a username and password, but we can actually copy and paste what we saw in the guide here, and then this will specify the domain, the username and password in order to get access to the share without having to pass your username and password. So let's go ahead and copy and paste the settings here. Let's go to the Bootstrap INI, paste that, and then we'll just need to modify this to show measure 3, and then you would just modify your domain, user ID, and password, and then skip VDD welcome, and then just save that file. All right, so our Bootstrap INI is saved, and we've also specified our rules settings here for our custom settings INI, and we can now hit OK. There's a note here that's really important about security reasons that if you're using MDT for deployment of your images, you probably don't want to specify your password in the Bootstrap INI file. But because we're only creating reference images, and this really should be just a standalone MDT server to create that reference image, we should not publish this to the production network. This is just really for creating your reference images. If you are using MDT for reference creation and deployment, then you probably wouldn't want to have a password that's just going to be sitting in a text file like that. So now let's take a look at our WinPE settings within our deployment share. So if we right click on the deployment share and go back to where we were, go to properties, we'll see our deployment share options, and we've got this Windows PE tab here. So what the steps are basically telling us to do now is to configure the image description and the name of the ISO file for both our x86 and x64 media. This is entirely up to you if you want to change the names. I'm just going to leave them the defaults, but you can change the description and the names of the files if needed. If you have multiple deployment shares, you might want to change the ISO names just so you know what deployment shares these images are used for, because we do bake in the information that's in your Bootstrap INI. This information is baked into the boot image. So that's how it knows what deployment share to hit. So you want to make sure that you're using the correct Windows PE media from the Light Touch PE. And then the last bit here is to update the deployment share. When we update the deployment share, this will actually create your Windows PE boot images. So let's cancel out of here and right-click on our share and say Update Deployment Share. Now we can go through and optimize the images. I'm just going to keep this at default and hit Next. And then this will take some time to create both the 32-bit and 64-bit images. So our image has successfully been created, or the deployment share, rather, has created the boot images successfully. So the next step in the guide is actually building the Windows 10 reference image. Now, there's a section in here that goes over some of the settings in the Bootstrap INI and the custom settings INI, so you can go through and read what these settings that you set earlier do. But the next step here is to really build the image out. So in order to do that, we need to build the image on a virtual machine. So we will be using Hyper-V to create this image. So let's move over to our Hyper-V host. And on our Hyper-V host here, I've got a virtual machine that I've already created. If you don't have a VM that you want to use, or you need to create a brand new one, we can create a new virtual machine by going to New and Virtual Machine, and then going through the wizard here. The steps in the guide will get you started on how to create that virtual machine. I'm going to actually use a VM that I already have created here, but what I want to show is under Settings, the different options that we have for creating this VM. Highly recommend to leverage at least 2 gigs of RAM and 2 virtual processors. This will speed up the image creation process. Don't enable dynamic memory. Using dynamic memory can cause some issues when it comes time to deploy and capture images, only because MDT leverages some validation rules for how much memory is on a device. And if the memory is too low, then you might run into an error and wondering why you failed when the VM should have worked just fine. So if you are going to use dynamic memory, just set the minimum amount of RAM to at least 2 gigs. That way you don't run into any failures because you don't have enough RAM. And you'll also want to make sure that you're booting from a CD. Oftentimes you'll have the first device might be an IDE controller. During the wizard, it goes through and has you select the CD or select what you want to boot from, but just make sure that CD is selected. And then when you have CD selected, you need to make sure that your DVD drive is actually pointing to an appropriate image file. So the image file that you need to copy is actually from your MDT server. So I'm connected to deployment share 3, and I've got a folder here called boot. So under boot, we see that there are quite a few different ISO files. You can take either x86 or x64 to boot from. Either of these doesn't really matter, because you can install in a 64-bit operating system from 32-bit boot media. So let's select our Light Touch image here and copy that. And then we need to put it somewhere local so we can boot off of it. So I've got a folder here called boot images. I'll just call this deployment share 3. And this is what I meant by having the same kinds of file names, is that I've got another boot image here. So notice that this one came from a different share, and I don't know what share that came from. So that's why naming these can be useful if you're using multiple deployment shares. But in this case, I've got a folder here called deployment share 3, so I know where this came from. So I want to use this as my boot image for this virtual machine. So I'll paste this into here, and just take out my double quotes, and then hit apply. And I'm ready to kick this virtual machine off. So if I hit start, so because this virtual machine has already been used, you'll see dirty environment found. And that's the reason I wanted to use a virtual machine that's already been used before, because when you do build and captures to build your reference image, you will come across using the same virtual machine multiple times. This is a message that you can get because you might have already had a deployment that was in progress before, you failed, you need to redo it. So this message will come up if you've already had a virtual machine you've already been using. If it's a brand new VM, not a problem, you won't ever see this message. So do we want to ignore this and start a brand new one? Yes. So it just processed the bootstrap INI file settings. So this is what is going to connect us directly into our task sequence. So we'll select our task sequence, and then it's going to ask us, where do we want to capture that to? So I'm going to capture into the captures folder, and I'm going to call this W10 edu, or W10 1511 edu 0365 pp. And then I like to put a date within the file name so I know exactly when that was captured. So I'll do this as 16 07 17, because that's the date of the capture of this image. And then that's it. So this virtual machine is going to go through, it's going to install Windows 10. It's going to install our applications with Office 365. It'll install our Visual C++ files and .NET 3.5. Also, it'll be completely patched through Windows Update, through our WSUS server that we specified. And this will take some time. We'll come back to this and see what it looks like when it's finished. So our image has completed. And we can see here that the image has been captured to our E deployment share 3 captures folder. And we can also see that the size of the image is about 5.5 gigs. So our virtual machine here has been turned off. It turned off automatically when it was done doing the capture. So at this point, this image can be blown, or this virtual machine can be reused to capture another image. It could be deleted. There's really no need for it at this point.